Something that locks the mind, though, is creative block.
I think you need to work through it and crack on with something regardless, because they're the moments, actually, that you might discover something really fascinating and really cool.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Sketchwave, our weekly show where we talk all things Procreate and digital art. And I say we because, as always, it's myself, Joel, and my co-host, the one and only James Julier. James, mate, how have you been?
Yeah, pretty good. It's half term here for the kids, so got them to contend with. Yeah, so it's been a busy couple of days, but yeah, all pretty good. I still managed to do a little bit of painting, a little bit of my own personal stuff. I'm working on the next course that I'm releasing as well, so I've got a bit of filming in.
Well, tell us a bit more about
that. It's going to be specialising on or focusing on trees this time. So the last one was a kind of a beginner introduction to landscape, so they did get quite complex and detailed. This time it's focused on trees, so there might be some background landscape elements, but the primary focus and going into some depth on some of the kind of rules of it will be about drawing and painting trees. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to getting that one complete. It's taken quite a long time because I don't want to rush at it. I want to make sure everything is just how I want it to be and make sure it's good product.
How does this work then? Is it for people who have already signed up and paid for the course? Do they get this new content, or is it another new part?
It's a new course. Some people have already paid in advance, so they signed up for the course at a discounted when they bought the first course. But then for anyone who's not, it will go on sale for everyone else as well at a later point. I'm thinking about June, so we're still a little while off yet for that. But I'm just trying to make sure it's a really good quality course for everyone.
So while we're talking about your course then, how do you find it in comparison to your YouTube content in terms of like the content creation or even just like the overall sort of creative process? Is it like very different? How does it differ if it does?
There are tutorial elements to it at the end. So there will be finished pieces that obviously I've developed a teaching style that is going to be quite similar in many ways to my actual YouTube content. But building up to that end point, there's quite a lot of foundational stuff that I typically just don't have the time for in tutorials. And I'm making that side of this course much more fleshed out than the first one. So I'm really looking forward to showing some of the details of this one off. And it is different in the sense that stuff that might be relatively dry and it isn't going to be catching people who are just a casual viewer when they click on a video. Because I think that sometimes our tutorials can act as entertainment and people just like to see them evolve as pieces of work. Whereas this is for people that really want to dig that bit deeper and just really understand some of the kind of foundational stuff as well. And I'm teaching myself as I go, because although I have been drawing and painting trees for years and years, and it's one of my favorite things to do, when you actually sit down and you have to teach something, then you start to just really look at the overall thing a little bit differently, and teaching, they say that if you have to teach something, then that's the best way of learning it yourself. So I'm finding it quite interesting. And for example, there's a Da Vinci rule or he developed a theory on the way that trees grow, which I'm not going to go into now, spoilers, but but yeah, he went into, people can Google it anyway, but he had a certain theory on how trees grow and the kind of proportions of branches in relation to the tree trunk and things like that, which I found really interesting. I didn't really know about that until I started doing the research for this course. And yeah, it was really quite revealing and quite interesting just for me. So I'm hopefully some of the stuff that I'm going to be covering will be really cool for people.
That's cool. It's so many. Go on.
I was just going to move along from me. I get very awkward when I talk about myself, but I was just going to move it along to ask how your week's been, really.
To be honest, I feel a bit checked out at the minute. Like I can't really remember anything that I've done in the last week. And I think we've spoke about a few times. I think maybe even on air or off air, I can't really remember. But at the end of last year, I was at such a pace. I felt like I was in fifth gear and just cruising and was like just doing everything. And then now I am just doing what I need to do in terms of like a YouTube tutorial and a Patreon tutorial in a week. And then the rest of the time, I'm taking it easy. At the same time, editing this, but I'm also doing like housework and stuff and little bits of renovation here and there that we're doing. So it fills up the week, but it's nice to kind of be able to say, like, I've done my obligations and I've still got loads of spare time. I can now focus on the things that I know I need to do at the same time. And those things are quite therapeutic to do and, progress, your environment that you work in and whatnot and you live in. So, yeah,
you're not been in the house too long, have you?
It.
It's only a few months now. You've moved
since August. So, yeah,
it's
just 6 months.
Yeah,
just over 6 months now. So,
right.
It's not that long. And then with Christmas and New Year's in that time, you kind of, that whole period, you don't really do too much. And now it's like picking that pace back up. But in terms of like content creation on YouTube and stuff and Patreon, still doing everything. And like I said before, like I'm really happy with the content I'm making and like really happy with it, if anything. But I'm happy at the pace I'm going right now. And I'm trying not to take on anything else that's like, in that space anyway, that's going to be like overpowering and stuff. So
very
just
wise,
trying to
I think.
Take it easy. I mean, to be honest, we've had so many conversations, whether it be on air or off air, about like what you do in your week. And typically you've got your YouTube tutorial and then an extended one.
Yeah.
And at the time I was like, man, I'm pumping out content like I couldn't imagine. Whereas now I must admit, like as time's gone on and we checked out for Christmas a little bit and had a break, I'm like, do you know what? I think James might have been right, I think he was onto something. His pace is nice. I'm not absolutely killing myself every week. So, I'm trying to focus on me a little bit more.
You want to make sure that when you are doing the tutorials that you've got the energy and focus to really put as much as you can into them, don't you, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they're the things that we've built everything around, aren't they? And then, the extra things are nice if you've got time for it, but you don't want to do it at the expense of the core thing that you do.
Exactly.
So yeah, this episode we're doing something a little bit different. We've had member questions before, but we think we're going to devote a bit more time to it on this episode. It might be something that we do on future episodes too. So we've probably told you in the past that you can submit your questions. There is a form down in the description, and you can fill that in and send that to us. You can have it anonymous, or you can put your name on it, and we will go through the questions, review them, and then answer the ones that we feel that we've got something substantial to say about. So I'm going to kick it off. I'm going to start with a question from Becky, and it reads, do you think it's important for artists to have an easily identifiable style, so you can create in a number of styles, i.e. realism, illustrative, watercolors, retro, painterly, kawaii, etc.? I'm not sure what that one is.
I think they're quite cutesy little drawings, I think,
right, okay.
As far as I'm aware.
So do you think it's important for artists to have an easily identifiable style? What would you say?
I think for like most general people, there's a few types of styles that are easily identifiable. Like watercolor is highly identifiable because it just has a certain aesthetic to it. But I think there are a lot of styles where I think potentially to most people, the world is a bit kind of blended. I mean, there's so many times where I'll make a tutorial and someone will say, what is this style? And truth be told, like I'll just say like, I just wanted to draw something that I thought looked really cool, whether it's using paintbrushes or not, or using, watercolor brushes or charcoals or pencils, it doesn't really matter. Like for me, it's about, creating an art style. So I'm talking on behalf of myself at this point, but I mean, as in for me, I think I will create content that I think is just, something I enjoyed making and just rolled with it and all the brushes kind of flowed. But I think it's tough. I think we, to a degree, we can be a little bit hypocritical in a sense, because I think the best way you can really learn to do art in any sense is once you find what you really enjoy drawing or painting or creating, you should lock in on that quite a bit, like give that majority of your time. And I say we're hypocritical in a sense because, I've created a landscape, for example, that's out on YouTube currently, and it's a desert scene and it's using the dry ink brush and some, just solid brushes or soft air brushes as well. But then next week it's a charcoal design. So it's like I'm hypocritical by saying you should stick to something, whereas we don't. And I think in our space, we know that we need to create content that isn't too repetitive week after week. But I think for people who are trying to get into art that really, really want to lock in and focus in, I think potentially being able to identify a style yourself first and say, that's the style I really like, that's the avenue I want to go down, and then see over time how that changes and grows. But in terms of other people being able to identify your style, I don't think it really matters. But maybe for your own sake, if you can at least identify what sort of realm you're in, it can be easier to potentially to find reference material. It could be, and just people of inspiration potentially. I mean, what do you think about it?
I think it's two different. I mean, because we're coming at it as teachers, and so we do like to create variety. And so one particular style isn't necessary. Although we've had guests on the show, haven't we, who have very specific styles, and it's really cool to see that. And in some senses, it helps if you're presenting yourself as an artist primarily, which is not what we do, is it? As such, although art is very much what we do, and that's our expertise. We're teaching people and giving other people the skills to find. So we can vary. Or we can have something that's very anime style, or something that's super realistic, or you've done a couple of kind of traditional kind of Chinese or Japanese kind of watercolor aesthetics.
Yeah.
So they can vary quite wildly. Now, you said on a recent episode that left to your own devices, you would gravitate towards certain color palettes and certain subjects, and I'm the same. My personal style is kind of realism, but with a surreal subject matter, really. And that's just, I think when you found what you enjoy doing, then that's your style. It's as simple as that. I mean, we have to vary it up a little bit. We're trying to keep it fresh for people who are watching. And if we just did the same, like I'm doing traditional paintings at the minute, and inevitably it gravitates towards kind of burning embers and fire and glowing things and tree textures, and that's fine. But if I was doing that as tutorials week in, week out, then I think I'd lose people after, 2 weeks or something. So I think it's different perspective as an artist. I think it can help, because if you're trying to get your name known in any way as an artist, then it's probably good to have an identifiable niche of some sort. But if you're not at that stage and you're just doing it for fun, then I think just lean in towards that, because that's where you're going to find the most success anyway. I don't think it's necessary to have, I don't think it's that important to have one particular style. Not initially. I think it evolves on its own. And if you start looking for, if you go out there and say, well, I'm going to do anime inspired work, and that's the only thing you research, and that's the only thing you're aiming for, and I think you're limiting yourself. And it's good to have a bit of variety initially, unless what you love is so specifically one thing. And like, for example, I think back to the artists I was looking at, HR Giga and JMW Turner, and they're quite different artists, really. One's very painterly, and one's airbrush, and it's super, neat edges, really, and completely different subject matters. But they've blended into what I create, in terms of what I love to do. That they have filtered through. So maybe find the artist that you love, but then just do what you love to do as well, And I think that styles grow out of your passions rather than an intent to follow a particular direction.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And maybe it's because we look at it constantly from that content creator kind of point of view, which I think is the right terminology to kind of describe us in a sense. It's just content creators, because the content we're trying to reimagine and redo and change a little bit week to week rather than lock in. But I think there are artists on YouTube, for example, that do their work like professional work. I mean, if you think about it, Miko is very much in that category.
Yeah.
He has a defined style, but at the same time, his creativity, which is just like unmatched, is just like every design is something completely different from from video to video.
Yeah.
So it's worth trying to also, I think, potentially look at people and digest potentially how they appear, at least online, in that sense of like, does this person change their style? No. Okay, so what do they do that's unique to them, and then in each piece as well, how do they change it? Because that may end up potentially unlocking some ideas for you. They might be in it, like, for example, if you follow Miko, for example, again, his creativity is just awesome and just unmatched. The fact that those ideas may help that you then flow if you create watercolor designs or something like that. Those type of concepts at least are very separate from the style, aren't they? Concept and style.
Yes.
So yeah, but at the same time, if you're someone who really, really wants to, really up your skill and really, go for it and try and become the best at it, you really should try and just really narrow the content spectrum that you look at and try to sort of lock in a bit on it and maybe draw repetitive things to try and up that kind of the skill value, because there's things you do every single time. And I used to hear people say this all the time, that like, you just change one thing in the next piece, or you do something slightly different, whatever it may be. And it is true. You just pick up this one thing that you did slightly differently, or I'll just try, a great example was, and I've not done it yet, but you mentioned in last week's tutorial, and I asked you, how did you do those reeds of grass? And you said to use the smudge tool with the studio pen. And I was like, he's bang on, but why didn't I think about that? And then it's like, well, how do I then, okay, next time you come to do it, you go, okay, I could maybe implement that tiny little adjustment. So it's not sometimes looking at the whole piece and maybe whatever the tutorial it is we're doing. It's just those tiny things and go, okay, cool. He made grass look so effective that way. Next time I draw grass, I'll do it and see how that looks, and so on and so on. So I think if you can try and stick in that lane, and you'll learn how to do it. Because I mean, if, let's say hypothetically you were going to shift into something completely different, you were going to draw cutesy, very like I don't even know the style name, and that's why I don't even think about styles enough, because I don't even know the terminology, but very cutesy, very cartoony kind of emoji style kittens, for example. Let's really niche it down. I think the first few,
where I was going.
The first few maybe struggle a little bit, because you're trying to work out, well, how do you take someone's cat and what features do you look for and cutesify them in whatever way, and little techniques to make fur look a certain way, and their eyes and everything like that. But over time you build up, well, I've got sort of 10 ideas for eyes in my head that I know I can do, and 10 ideas for noses, and so on, and you end up building out this like mental catalogue, and it just becomes a breeze, and you fly through it, and you're not thinking about those things so much anymore. You're thinking then about how to make it better, if that makes sense. You go past the fundamentals. We mentioned in our landscapes that we've done recently, whether it's the time challenge or not, is the zigzag path kind of idea, where most of the time you will have someone draw, and you'll notice it once you see it, you can't, is like there's some sort of zigzag or S-like shape in the middle of a landscape, and it's there on purpose to take you from front to back and guide the eye through the design. But it's those things that you won't think about once you start implementing. But if you niche into there, you'll start to realize that they're the things that you just need to at least check off, and then you can carry on from there next time, and you know what to implement. I hope that makes sense. I wasn't rambling too much, but I'm very tired.
So let's move on to the next question then. So how do you create sorry, this is from Pete. How do you create your drawing inspirations? So what to draw, drawing style, colors. How do you combat, there's two different parts of this really. How do you combat art fatigue and creativity blocks? And we have kind of covered that in previous episodes, aren't we? So to a certain extent, we'll be rehashing things we have spoken about already, but that's fine. People perhaps have not seen the older ones. And so that's the question. So I'll just review it. So how do you create your drawing inspirations, what to draw, drawing style, colors, and how do you combat art fatigue and creativity blocks? So there's quite a lot to answer there,
I guess. Yeah, let's split it into the two sections, because one is about concept creation, isn't it? And then the second one is about mental state, almost to a degree. So create your drawing inspirations. Okay, so I'll speak for myself really, because obviously the content that we've already mentioned tends to vary week to week. So it's, again, I can say about, this week contrasts very differently to the 3 weeks that you're going to see on YouTube, whether it's the video, the tutorial we're going to talk about later on for me, and then this week's at the time of recording, and then the next week after that is 3 completely different styles. I've got like a dry ink version of a landscape, which has got lots of texture in it. And then a very, very super simplified one that only uses selections and using the selection tool. And then the week after that is charcoals and getting quite close to realism. So how do you create your drawing inspirations and what to draw? For me, it's what do I want to draw? It's just as simple as that. Like I'll scroll through Pinterest and be like, oh, yeah, that looks really impressive in black and white. And then for some reason, there's a as a content creator, you'll potentially just randomly just flick back and be like, somebody commented on a video actually asking if I could do another charcoal design, and that's in black and white, and that's inspired. Let's do it. All right, let's find a reference image, or even just start doodling. Like I'll start doodling straight away and just be like, okay, I'm working on this bird, but I don't really know what type of bird. Let's now go find a reference image. And then that's how that one came about. So drawing inspirations for me can be like Pinterest a lot of the time. Not so much Instagram, because sometimes I think Instagram is a flooded place at the minute with potentially like intensely heavy, detailed AI content in a way that when you look at it, you think, well, anything I make is not going to be as heavily granular and detailed potentially. Sure. Like they're like super edits where it's like super, like you can imagine there's like, what's the word? When you ask it to do something, I can't even remember what it's called anymore. Prompts, little small prompts, like at the end of the path, add some flower pots. Mm-hmm. At the end of here, add this and add that and that. So it can appear very intense. So I stick away from Instagram. Where do you look for your inspirations? Do you ever, one question I'll add to that is, do you look back at any of your work ever and it give you inspiration?
Yes. So I tend to, so after I've looked back through, the recent videos, then I'll get a concept of the kind of thing that I might want to do. And then, I have used Google a lot in the past. I don't tend to use it as much as I used to. I think Google is fairly limited, but Pinterest is useful. Instagram can be useful. But yeah, it's a matter of stitching together sort of reference images, and if I sort of grab a color palette that I think would be useful, or a certain background on an image that I've found, or whatever it may be. But yeah, often as not, I will go searching for a particular type of thing once I've got a concept that springs to mind. I'm trying to include, for example, kind of structural elements in a lot of my more recent images. So obviously I'll go searching for images that have those kind of elements in it.
And I think the question actually nicely, maybe you'd reorder it slightly, but it's like drawing inspiration and then what to draw, drawing style, and then colors.
Yeah.
In a way, that's almost the flow state for me. It's like what to draw. Once I find that, I think about my mindset is, okay, I know I want to draw a desert scene. Okay, what do I want to draw it in? Do I want to do like a loose painting? Do I want to do like soft airbrush style again? And because at least for me as a creator, it's like I'll have certain styles I like to go back to, or at least pairings of brushes and so on. So I'll be like, could I use the Blackburn brush this time? Because I've not used it in ages and I love that brush. But again, I still haven't used it, but I'll think, okay, could I use that? And to be honest, for me, that defines the style in terms of Procreate anyway. Admittedly, we'll draw something and most people could say, oh, that's almost fairly obvious, a James Julier or a Joel or whatever it may be, because there's certain things in there that, maybe stand out in terms of like, it's hard to explain really, but it's like we draw things in our certain way and, that then flows. The brushes just give it a general kind of aesthetic for me. And then the colors is very experimental phase, I'll know, and I don't know about you, but what type of kind of vibe I want to go for. And then as I'm making my way through it, I'll go, well, that green don't look quite right. And I'll just tweak it. I'll alpha lock the layer and be like, right, I'm going to change all those streaks to more saturated or more yellow, or I'll go into the adjustments and go to color balance and really shift the whole image. And for example, I could finish a design and I'll come back to it like a couple of hours later. And then I'll go, no, that is way too heavily tinted towards like a certain vibe. I'll change it, and then I'll have to meticulously then try and break down this like color changed version and handpick the colors again, and then re-edit the palette actual file and hold down on each one, delete it, or swap for the current active color. So I'll make those kind of changes multiple times before providing a product as a tutorial. How do you go about your colors? Is it just like straight off the top of the head and then see what else flies?
It is when I do my personal work. If I'm just painting for fun, then it kind of just flows, and I won't even create a color palette in advance. It'll just be grabbing colors off the color wheel and just feeling it as I go, really. But when it comes to the tutorials, I've usually had a reference, so I will have created the palette, and they'll be all grabbed colors, and they're very specific. And we've been through the process of how we create those color palettes from a reference in a previous episode, haven't we? So it has a very methodical approach to it. So they're kind of locked in for me for the most part with my tutorials, and I've usually tested them if there's any sense that maybe those colors are not going to work. I've normally ironed it out during the color palette creation phase, but not 100%. Sometimes it goes a little bit wrong in the execution of it, so then I have to change the saturation and other, the lightness within the adjustments and things. But yeah, usually I've used the reference, so I've just grabbed the colors and, for the tutorials at least anyway, but not for my personal work. It's such a contrast between the way I work with the tutorials and my personal work. It's odd, really, because I'm not methodical at all when it comes to my personal work. I just completely random and by the seat of my pants, really. But you can't be like that with a tutorial, can you? You have to be prepared. So yeah.
Yeah, the way our tutorials need to work, isn't it? It's got to be a plan in action to a degree that's just very linear. Very occasionally, I'll be like, I want to go back and change this. And I say to myself, well, I either have to redo it and go back all the way back to that stage, or I'll just say, listen, I just want to make a quick adjustment and I'll do that now. But most of the time, it does need to be quite linear, doesn't it? Rather than just chuck something in, see how it goes and be like, no, let's undo that. I mean, if you did something without any purpose, it'd be a nightmare.
It can't be too chaotic. You don't want to confuse people and start grabbing colours all over the place and going too much back to the colour wheel. People like to know from the start that they've got everything that they're going to need, don't they? So, yeah, it tends to be just, find the reference. I mean, you don't have to stick 100% to any references, and I think that's important that people understand that. And you may take 80% of a reference, but then you only, you take the bits that you want, and there might be some clutter and noise and details that just aren't necessary. And there's colors and compositions that you want to take as inspiration, but then you feel free to, and that goes for our tutorials too. People don't have to stick slavishly to what we show. And I enjoy seeing people's work when they've followed our tutorials clearly, but then they've either added different elements or they've constructed it in either even compositionally in a different way, or just gone off at their own tangent. I think that's a really nice thing to see. So to use our videos and our tutorials as a reference in a sense, and then people push it in their own direction, I think is a really cool thing to do.
Absolutely. And what about the second part? How do you combat fatigue and creativity blocks?
I think.
Or do you think it's a thing? Do you even think it's a thing?
I remember times, perhaps more so when I was younger, and knowing that I wanted to be creative, feeling the energy of I want to do something creative and not really knowing. I think that I've gone past that stage now for the most part, and I tend to just start doing something if I feel well, I've got the time, and that's a large part of it these days. When I have the time, I can't afford to waste it, so I just crack on with something. And I've learned to do that over the years, that it is just doodling and seeing what happens sometimes. In terms of creative inspiration for the tutorials, well, I think just throwing different elements in the mix and thinking, well, what haven't I done for a long time? What have I never done before? And just tackling new things, really. But yeah, because we have to keep it fresh and create variety in our tutorials, don't we? So we do constantly have to think, not just from our perspective of what we will find interesting and keep our creativity going, but we have to think what the people would want to see that we haven't already done 1,000 times. I mean, I'm very guilty of cycling back, and I don't necessarily think it's a problem, but cycling back to the same old kind of tried and tested things that work, because I know that although it's the same thing and you might be a little bit repetitive, there's always new approaches and there's new techniques and there's things that you've got better at and you've developed, and I find that endlessly fascinating too. So I don't know how many trees and how many hills and how many mountains I've drawn, but then they're always anew every time you create one, because you're approaching it with fresh eyes and new understanding, and hopefully pushing it a little bit further and making it better. And I prioritize quality over variety anyway in my general work. So if I find something, we've talked about this, if you find something you really like doing, then do it 1,000 times. It doesn't have to be something you move on from. And I think that's how you get really good at things, is being willing to do it again and again and again, and it's that repetition sometimes that makes you really good at things. So yeah, from a YouTube perspective, I think it's important that we don't get too repetitive. But if you're just doing art for your own sake, then I think actually finding the things that you enjoy doing and keep doing them. And I think it'd be very difficult to not evolve. Like if you set out to do a tree drawing or a tree painting every day, well, you're not gonna end up with the same drawing every time. I think sometimes people move too quickly on from something and think, well, I've drawn a tree. What else can I do? It's like, well, draw
Yeah.
another tree. Draw it in a different way. You could draw a million trees and you could still create a new tree the next day. I think
Yeah.
that I don't think you need to have a new thing to draw and to be inspired. I think you can just keep doing the same things as long as you're exploring and you're still looking for new ways of doing it. I think that even the same subject matter can be endlessly fascinating.
But at the same time, just to play devil's advocate, I guess,
Sure.
is although we've both said the same thing of like sticking to, something and really locking in, part of that question is how do you combat art fatigue?
Yeah.
And I think potentially at the same time, as much as we say, that's what you could do. You should kind of, if that's what the route you want to go down, lock in on it a bit. However, if you start to feel that fatigue, experimenting and playing with like different methods and different styles. I mean, you have done in the duration we'd be doing the show, for example, messing with all sorts of different work, whether it was the mural that you did at the school or the stuff that, you've been just drawing for yourself and stuff like those styles and separation can like, I don't know, maybe unlock something a little bit more by just having a play with something else and then coming back to the mission objective to a degree. So potentially trying something different for a little bit can equally also try and, I don't know, open up your mindset and not give you too much tunnel vision potentially. Because it's like when I'll often finish a design and come back to it and go, should have added this, should have added this, should have added this. And it's like stepping away. And if you'd gone and done so, what I'm saying is if you're feeling creative, but you're also a bit locked in your lane and feel a bit like you need to be creative some way, but you can't, then trying something different and coming back might actually, unlock the mind a little bit.
Yeah.
Something that locks the mind though is creative block. Real thing or not a real thing?
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, I think people they get unstuck. They want to be creative, but they just don't know where to start, and that's creative block. And they feel frustration, and it's all a subjective thing. And you can not allow yourself to have creative block, but then some people would say, "Well, I don't allow myself to be depressed," but it doesn't mean depression is not real, does it? Some people feel it, and therefore it's real for them. You can have the frame of mind where you've got a fairly robust approach to it and you go, I will not allow myself to have creative block, and that's fine. And if that's what works for you, but that's not to say that people don't experience it, because clearly they do. I remember experiencing it. But you've just got to keep working anyway through it. I think as long as you don't allow it to stop you doing something, then you'll find a way through it. I think the problem is that people allow it to stop them even getting started. And I think if that's what you've allowed to do, then you've created a problem. What you need to do is create work even when you feel like you don't know what you're going to do. Because sometimes it's in those moments of, it's like kids, and I say kids these days, but it's constant discussion at home, in terms of like kids have screens and TV and, there's always something to do. And so do they experience boredom? Do they have those moments where they have to invent their own creative ideas so much? I mean, they do, but I think when things come too easily, then actually you may be missing an opportunity to discover something new. And it's those times where you really don't know what you want to do and what you're going to do that you might actually find something really interesting. So I think you need to work through it and crack on with something regardless, because they're the moments actually that you might discover something really fascinating and really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's other factors that come into it. Most of the time, if I've felt any kind of like, whether it's fatigue or block or whatever, like being now 4 years into doing the content creation, it's like I have to, you sort of work out little sort of identifiable things that can be like, well, why are you feeling like this? You know, are you exhausted? Are you tired? Like, did you get a really bad night's sleep? All right, fair enough. And then to supplement that, do you feel like you need to have a coffee or, another coffee just to perk you up, or, get up and do something for a minute and then come back to it? So get the mind working and get the body moving to see if that helps. Because there'll be times I'll be like sat at my desk and I'll go, 5 minutes, 5 minutes on TikTok, that's fine. And then I'm like this. And because I'm leaning down, I feel like my eyes are getting heavier and my head's getting heavier and I'm slouching. And then I feel really, ugh. So then I'll be like, I've got to get up. I've got to get up and do something. And then that helps me out a little bit, gets the mind moving. But I feel, for me, it's like looking for the factors potentially, tired, fatigue, or have I got something on my mind, or is there something that's potential? For me, a lot of the time, how my mind works is if I know, for example, I don't know, we've got someone coming round at, say, 2:00 in the afternoon to do X, Y, and Z, whatever. My mind won't allow me to get into creative space because I know there's this thing coming that's only going to delay it later on. So my mind works in a way where I'm like, nope, can't do that.
Yeah.
Not today, because 2:00's coming and every minute that passes is closer. And so you're not going to get the time to do what you need to do. In reality, that's absolute crap, but I could get there. So identifiable factors for me is like trying to work out for blocks that could really help. But stepping away really equally does help at the same time, and when I say stepping away, I don't mean just for like a minute or an hour. Like, come back to like art as such in a week. Your mind will be totally different. You, Flo, we've all said exactly the same thing on this show, that sometimes when we have our breaks, by the end of like a holiday, I'm like raring to grab my iPad. Like, I can't wait to grab my iPad and start drawing. But that's after like, okay, you had your first week of your holiday. You're relaxed. You've been drinking a little bit. You've been merry for 7 days. It's lovely. The sun's out. And then as each day passes, I'm like, it's a bit itchy. God, it's kind of creative. And then by the end of it, on the plane, you're like, get me home. I need my iPad. And you just feel that energy inside you, being like, I'm refreshed. I'm good to go. So walking away for sure is one that I will do a lot of the time. And I think we're lucky enough that we do have the opportunity potentially sometimes with like the content that we release to be able to say, I could probably take 4 or 5 days off and just really say to myself, go do some gardening or do some home improvements, and then come back to it. And you might be like, boom, I am good to go. I am locked in.
Yeah. Good advice.
Yeah, that's all I've got. That's all I've got otherwise for creative blocks. So thank you, Becky and Pete, as well, for your questions. We really appreciate it. We do have more questions that we've got received, so we will try and tackle a few more of them throughout your submissions. But again, if you want to go ahead and submit a question for the show, there's a link to it in the description down below. You can leave it anonymously, or you can put your name beside it and you'll get a little shout out in the show. James, let's take a look at your latest YouTube tutorial, which I could say is almost a sister tutorial, I reckon, to your previous one, bar the fact it's quite daytimey in comparison.
Yes.
Talk me through it.
Yeah, it wasn't even intentional. It's only when I posted it on Instagram and I saw the one I'd done previously, I thought, blimey, they're pretty much the same, aren't they? But you're right, in terms of the tree growing on the left side and the orientation of the piece. And yeah, it's very similar to the last one, although I didn't conceive of it that way. It wasn't intentional. It must have just lingered around in my mind a little bit. Again, we talk about finding images. I found a really nice, it is quite stylized in that kind of anime kind of style, Studio Ghibli, really vibrant colors. And I found an image that was the source of inspiration, and trying to include more structural elements. So although basically it's stuff that I've already done before, it's got the little jetty on there that I thought that was the bit I really struggled with as well. So
yeah. In what way? No. Talk me through it.
The biggest difficulty was creating the lines, because you just take a rectangle and you can distort it into the shape, but then getting all the lines, because they're not just to create that sense of perspective, like the bottom left part of it, or the right part of it, but at the bottom left of the canvas, those lines are going to be a slightly different angle than they are at the top. So the ones that are at the top, or the distant part of the jetty, are almost horizontal, and the ones that come down here are slightly pitched. and getting the perspective of those lines in a way that worked, just personally I found a little bit tricky. I was scratching my head trying to think of a technique and a method that would have been easier to convey that and explain that, but I struggled. Go on then. Go on, tell me, Joe.
I just had one when I heard you say it. I was like, I would fill the whole canvas with lines and wood grain and then just distort it to fit the shape that you made.
True. You could do that.
And just drag it into the top, I say top left, the furthest left side and then the right side, and then drag those points. It's just an idea.
No, it's fair. But I think for me, I tend to leave things kind of thinking, I diminish them in my mind as to how difficult they're going to be until I'm there in the moment. And then I'm already mid-recording and I didn't really want to go step back and then start creating a whole... But I can see that totally. I did that with the actual rectangle. Had I created the rectangle and done the lines on it first and then distorted the whole thing, that might have been a better method, actually. I could have done it all as one thing when I distorted it. So yeah, that's a fair point. I could have done the whole thing, couldn't I? But even then, you'd have to distort it in a way that put the lines in exactly the right place, wouldn't you? And it's not just about distorting. It's not just about squashing. It needs like a vanishing point that would be quite far away to give that kind of arc of perspective, wouldn't you? Because that's the bit I struggled with. But I was really happy with the overall results. I really wanted that summer vibe. We're still very cold here in the UK, aren't we? We've not got any of that summer feel at all yet. So I'm very much looking forward to it. I mean, we have a bit of a dilemma. I tried to make things seasonal to a certain extent, but we've kind of I've done enough snow. There isn't any snow here now anyway. I don't want to do rain and greyness and kind of just boring Yorkshire, grey landscapes, really. So I kind of, I'm itching to get vibrant colours and really nice greens in there. So I just went for a summer vibe, and it was a really nice thing to do. So, yeah. I used
the shadows on the decking, by the way, look awesome.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I really enjoy doing strong summer dappled light shadows on things. I've done it a few times now on architectural surfaces or just on the ground on paths and things. But and I use the Evolve brush pretty much exclusively for all the foliage and
oh, nice.
Even the distant areas as well, the distant trees and things like that. So heavy use of the Evolve brush. Now I've used the Evolve brush before on a different one, and it came out a little bit blocky. I think maybe because it was autumn colours, it I don't know. There's something about it didn't work quite as effectively. But I think with the greens, somehow the Evolve brush really works nicely with that, and I really enjoyed it. I did start to use the the Rainforest brush on it as well, and then I had to scrap that because it just wasn't working. Oddly enough, normally it's my go-to brush, but the Evolve brush, I think because I started with that and it had a crispier look to it, then going in with the soft Rainforest brush aesthetic just didn't really marry the two together. So I stuck with the Evolve brush pretty much throughout that.
Am I spotting a dry ink brush there in the foreground?
Yes, that's the one. It's a little bit.
Love that brush.
Yeah, it is nice, isn't it? I mean, I tend to go with the Studio Pen a lot of the time, but the dry ink has a softer kind of tip, doesn't it, when it reaches the end sometimes, which looks more authentically like those kind of blades of grass, I suppose. So, yeah.
It's funny, the longer we do this and like the breakdowns of them, I'm like zooming in and like I'm looking at all the different brushes used, and I'm like, I can pretty much identify most of them in here to a degree, bar one, which I think is I don't know if it's just your brush strokes or it's throwing me off. What's the brush that's been used for the tiny bit of green and white that is just the end of the jetty and on the water surface there? What brush is that?
It's just the Leatherwood brush, but not spaced out, I think.
Oh, okay.
As I remember.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So just the default settings on the Rainforest. Leatherwood brush. Yeah. Yeah.
Lovely. It looks awesome. Again, just looks just the lovely blend out of all the colours in the distance. That's a little bit of a tricky thing that I'm still trying to lock in a little bit, is getting those blues and allowing the distant objects just to slowly get more and more light. And I think it's also like an interesting balance, isn't there, of like the detail fall off. Like sometimes it feels, is it too abrupt that I've made the detail fall off between these two masses of land? Or is it like, should there be a little bit on the further ones? But this just nails it because there's 3 different tiers there that gives you that nice breakdown of near to far in terms of the distance stuff across the other side there. Again, my favorite part's got to be the lighting on the decking of the jetty. It looks awesome.
Thank you.
Did you darken first and add highlight after? I'm assuming so, looking at the brush strokes.
Yeah. Might be a slight mixture of the two, but yeah, I think it started off with the darker colours and then added a bit of light on top. I think that's generally the way I approach the jetty. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I love it. I really like the fact it kind of sisters to and I say sisters, don't take that the wrong way. I'm not saying it's like you've copy pasted it, because it's completely its own piece at the same time. But I think it's more just the orientation and certain parts of it that like look like it. But at the same time, this is what we were saying is like this one is different. This one is concept might be the certain elements that marry in a sense, but colors, brushes, everything else is different. Like it's completely different. The color palette alone is just like, previous week's one was slightly more contrasted, and a little darker, whereas this has got that lovely like bright colorful aesthetic to it, that kind of anime style, which is just like, it's cool to see that you can apply it in so many different ways, which is just cool to see, and just also should be like, inspiring to be like, yes, as long, look, flip that coin from week to week. Do you want to draw something that you've drawn before, but in a slightly different way? Or do you want to draw something completely new in a style you've done before?
Yeah.
And then flip it around kind of thing. I think it's awesome.
Should we move on to your piece?
Yes, so probably maybe a similar kind of mental vibe anyway, of being like, bored of doing cold, miserable rubbish, and I don't necessarily think I've done too many of it, but, just a lovely, warm sort of desert scene. Yeah. Maybe, I don't want Disney coming after me here, but maybe a little bit, Lion King inspired. It is my favorite film of all time, cartoon version, not the new one. The new one is good, but the cartoon one just hits different.
Definitely.
And maybe a little bit inspired by a certain monument in that film, but slightly different for legal reasons, maybe. I don't know. But yeah, it's just fun. Just like messing around with that bright light source and crashing onto every little bit of rock, which, I must admit is a proper stressful and time-consuming thing to try and pull off grain and rock and grooving and all the that sort of stylized kind of approach to the rock and stuff was very fun. I must admit it was fun, but it does take a lot of mental capacity in a sense to like think about it and logistically think about it, how it all falls in. And cool. I wanted to do that path kind of approach, as we've been saying, this left-hand side. I feel like we're slightly higher up. Maybe a good 20 feet off of the ground, maybe on this kind of bottom part of the stairs, and the stairs could take us up and onto there. And maybe it could be in some sort of national park. Definitely not in the UK. Maybe Australia potentially, or America at a push, but maybe Australia more so. But yeah, it's cool messing around with like reverb lighting as well, just like in my mind at least, of like it bouncing off the sand and to the underside of the fallen rock or the bridge or whatever you want to call it. And that's something I am trying to think about a little bit, is like a few things like, does the sky and the blues of the sky, should that be landing on things? And it does in this. Where is the light crashing? How is it bouncing up potentially to the underside of objects and so on? So dry ink like crazy in this one. It is the main brush completely, bar one that maybe was the sand. I can't remember. But yeah, rocks are fun, aren't they? We've said it loads of times.
Well, it's brave, because normally the rocks are an element that I just I can leave till last, and then I use a bit of an airbrush on them. Or I've done one that quite recently that I enjoyed doing in the end. But this is all rocks, isn't it? So pretty much, So you've really been brave and gone for it. It looks great. And again, you've similar to what you were saying on mine. You've got that. The light hitting the ground in certain areas and creating those cooler colours in the shadow areas, and then there's really vibrant sun impacting on the open sort of areas, and it's a really nice contrast. I find it really fascinating the way that light interplays in different areas. and this really captures it, especially underneath the thing. It casts a shadow, and it looks great. Really nice.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a bit of a slow burner, I think, on YouTube this week for this one, to be honest. And sometimes it's just, you don't. It could be multitude of different reasons as to why, but I'm glad it's out there on YouTube. And I can imagine most of the time, to be honest, something like this with the duration. I can't remember what the duration was. Maybe it's obviously in over an hour because it's me. But that type of thing I would normally try and keep to Patreon. But this is what I'm saying at the minute is I feel like usually I'd keep my more advanced or technical tutorials for Patreon, and YouTube would still have cool content, but it wouldn't be to the same degree. I feel like at the minute I'm kind of doing a very consistent level, but it's across all platforms. So that's where I feel like I'm at the minute anyway. And then, just like changing it up week to week. So next week's will look even more different. But
there is that pressure, I think, for us, isn't there, that we'll constantly improve what we do. And I think there is that anyway, from an artist's point of view. But I think naturally, if you go back to some of your early tutorials, I know for mine, look back at some of my early ones, and I'd zoom in and they look atrocious. Whereas, these days that I'm happy with the way they look when they're zoomed in, and it's just so much more detailed. So,
however, this is the curse of just artwork in general, especially if you're teaching other people to do it, because we've said before how potentially sometimes a negative, and this is no way intended to necessarily be a negative post, but it stayed in my mind completely. Someone left my Patreon, and when you leave Patreon, because by the way, Patreon, you can come and go whenever you wish. That's the way. That's the beauty of it. You can come and go for a month and then leave it and then come back and so on. But someone left a bit of feedback to say the tutorials have got a bit too advanced for me, and I was like, "What? Really? No, what am I doing?" And then, like you said, if you go back and think about what you were doing a year ago, 2 years and 3 and so on, they probably have progressed in certain ways that have meant that it's actually tricky to, if you looked at something you created 2-3 years ago, I find it really tricky to go make that again into a tutorial and then be like, well, how do I prevent myself now from doing all these things that I've now picked up over time and the things I like to do? And actually just say, no, the bar is way lower down. You don't need to bring it all the way up to where you currently are. I find it really tricky. I think it's almost a bit of a curse as well. At the same time, you want to improve, but you also don't want to alienate your audience.
But I think sometimes that can be in the finished result rather than the process. People look, because we've got better at the process, we might have found more efficient ways of actually teaching it. And so therefore the end result looks better, but it might not. I mean, some of my earlier ones, the image might not look as good, but I know that I wasn't as good in the teaching methods either. So it might actually, on the face of it, look easier, but they're probably not, because now I found more efficient ways of creating certain things to make it easier. Although the finished product looks more advanced and more detailed, and may be a little bit time consuming because you're spending that time on the detail, doesn't necessarily mean it has to be more complicated. I mean, perhaps more time consuming, and that's something that people perhaps don't always have. Because I imagine, as much as it's a video of ours that's an hour long, it might take them 4 or 5 hours to actually follow it and pause it and recreate it. And I guess it's a totally different undertaking, isn't it, to follow a tutorial than create one. Although that does take us longer than that as well. But yeah, that's editing rather than the painting side of it, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, that's a wrap up of our latest tutorials. This isn't a sort of part of our memberships, but I do want to give a shout out to Cypher Bloom, David Stone, Cheryl Bentick, Cara, Nancy, Egg, and Cockle, because they are all members of the channel. If you want to become a member of the channel and support the channel, there's a join button in the description down below. You get early access to the show as soon as I've finished editing, and I'll do it as fast as I can. It's straight up onto YouTube, usually 6 days in advance or usually a week, for you to get early access to the show. You also get a loyalty badge beside your name that grows over time, the longer you are a supporter. And of course, you'll be supporting the work that we do here on the channel. James, thank you, mate, as always, for an awesome conversation and look back at our content. Oh, and by the way, again, just a reminder, if you want to leave us a question, there's a link to the form in the description down below. We'll be back next week for another episode of The Sketch Wave. Bye-bye for now.